By speaking into it?
Hello?
Yep, you're on.
Excellent.
And just that should be on. Yep.
I will. Perfect. Cool. Very good.
Do you want to start at the first one? Here?
Yeah, I'll start at the first one.
Awesome.
Lovely.
Good morning, everyone. All right, good morning, good morning, good morning. How's everyone doing this morning? Daylight savings? Yes, I know. It's good, at least we'll have some more sunlight. Welcome, my name is Joe Samuel. To my right, your left is the famous Betsy Samuel, my wife.
Not sure how to respond to that.
Yeah. My grandfather always told me, give your wife props. Make sure you always give your wife proper due. All right, all right. So welcome, everyone. Today, Betsy and I are really pleased to have a special guest here at our adult forum. We have Mr. Brian Kelly. Brian and his wife have two young boys, one of whom is in the same grade as our son, Carter. In fact, they're downstairs playing right now. It's funny, Brian is actually, this is not while he's here, but this is really interesting. Brian and Betsy are room parents for our boys at their class at Wingate Elementary School just here in Bethesda. So Brian's a friend, he's a neighbor, he and his wife are neighbors. Brian is with the International Organization for Migration. And Brian's going to talk a little bit about what they do, how he got into this. It's a very important function, I think, and I think we can all learn something about it. Brian and his wife have lived in a number of places, and they travel all over the world, which I'm always amazed at. They've been here in Bethesda for, what, about 2 years now?
Yeah.
About 2 years. They came from Thailand. They were in Bangkok, Thailand, and before that they had been living in, believe it or not, Pakistan. And so Brian is with the International Organization for Migration. What Brian told me something was really interesting. I didn't realize this. The organization was founded after World War II and really is responsible for all refugee programs here in the United States. So Brian's going to talk a little bit about what they do, again, how he got into it, and feel free to ask questions. He has a very conversational style, so feel free to ask questions during his presentation. Brian, thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Yeah, it was great to get the. Can you hear me? Yeah. No, it was great to get the invitation from friends like Joe and Betsy, and thanks for welcoming the Kelly family in when we moved. I'm a humanitarian aid worker, although actually technically. I'm a former humanitarian aid worker, and now I'm a DC bureaucrat. From time to time, I still get my boots dirty, like when the cyclones were smacking through the Caribbean, and then the day after I was in Dominica. But more time now is spent liaising with the U.S. government and other partners, and being a classroom parent, and being a deputy assistant baseball coach to the team that my boy and Carter is on. It was but had been working as a humanitarian aid worker for about 18 years overseas, and then just returned about a year and a half ago. I must admit, it was an interesting time to come back to the U.S. as the UN representative of the Migration Agency in D.C. You know, and I used to run our office in Kandahar. It's just different levels of toughness, and I really want to talk about migration and displacement. Most importantly, I want to talk about what you're interested in talking about. I don't have any presentation. I just have a few different websites that we can jump from one to the other. And I thought the common interest is that your tax dollars pays for the generation of a lot of the data and information that's on these different sites. So again, there's no presentation. really talking about displacement and migration. And I can focus it more internationally or what we do here in the U.S. And I was asked to just talk a little bit about how I got into the business. And the way that occurred was just had done a semester overseas during undergraduate work, enjoyed it, started calling all these different organizations. It was back when the people in this room will remember when you'd communicate with a pen and a letter and a stamp and put it into IRC and Save the Children and CARE and Mercy Corps and a bunch of other organizations who all collectively, were saying, hey, go join the Peace Corps, call me when you get out. And then I followed up with the thank you letter, and probably today it'd be called a harassment campaign, because I just kept on. And then NATO started bombing the former Yugoslavia back in '99, and there was a very large surge of the international community. This very good NGO, and I work for the UN Migration Agency, but no one does anything by themselves. There's a very good NGO called the International Rescue Committee, IRC, that does a lot of refugee resettlement work here in the US and fantastic development and humanitarian work overseas. And they called me up and they said, are you ready to go to Kosovo as an education volunteer? And that's what my academic background had in. And I said, absolutely. I said, when would we go? And they said, the day after tomorrow. And I think really the purpose of the call was for them to say, you remember we gave you your chance, and could you just stop calling us? But I said, sounds great. I recall to this day living in this fairly rundown brownstone in Hartford, Connecticut, and lifting up that heavy wooden window with the single pane of glass that was rattling, dumping about a quarter of my stuff into the alley behind, unplugging my phone, and taking off. And 18 years later, I came back to Bethesda, and it's been wonderful to be able to help people who are in incredibly unfortunate circumstances. And that the time in Kosovo led to Afghanistan, and the time in Afghanistan led to Indonesia after the tsunami, and then with the peace process, and the time then led to Pakistan, which unfortunately had so many different challenges, from an earthquake to the conflict to floods to you name it, and time in the U.S. or time in Iraq with when the Yazidis were getting pushed north by ISIS, and shorter stints in Yemen, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's great to be in Bethesda. It really is. So anyhow, so that's my background. I'm kind of done with that, and really wanted to talk to you about a far more important issue, which is just the issue of people on the move, and the issue of migration. I just put up this. This is where my organization's website rests. And again, like I said, there's no presentations or anything, but I just thought you might want to find source material if you were interested in this issue in the future. It's iom.int. And now for words that'll be too small to read, if you could go to the next slide. One of the different source materials that again gets generated through your tax dollars and the tax dollars of other taxpayers from other countries is just statistics about migration, and this is one of the pages on the site. A couple things that I wanted to just bring to everyone's attention is that you'll see up there that actually you won't be able to see, the font's too small, but 48% of migrants are female. So we're talking about basically a 50-50 split. So all the different issues, and it's about international migrants, all the different issues that you think about with gender roles, cultural issues, economic issues, family obligations and responsibilities. They're all incredibly apparent and important with with the issue of people on the move, because we literally have about a 50-50 split. And you have to think about it within the context of labor migration. You got to think of, there's the conscious decision. There's Joe sitting next to Betsy, and a decision is made that the money, Betsy, that you represent working in somewhere else is more important than the ability to hold each other's hand. You know, it's a conscious decision that families have to make when they say that your lack of a presence is more important to the family than your presence. The money that you could represent working in Qatar is more important than your presence here. So this transactional component is already there. There's a certain hardness that's evolved. The collective decision to have people move. So imagine that you're a Bangladeshi and you've moved to Libya, you're working in the oil fields. It's not a zero-sum game to get there. Your family probably went into debt. Did you do it through regular means or irregular means? Maybe you did it through irregular means, which means that there were quite a few payoffs that were there. Even if there weren't payoffs, there's still the various costs, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 that would take to get you. And then you're there, you're working, Gaddafi's overthrown. Country collapses. What do you do? Well, I know that we moved about 30,000 Bangladeshis back to Bangladesh after post-Gaddafi Libya. And can you imagine, the saddest thing was the talking with my colleagues who had spoken about the day after in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, the capital of Bangladesh, where the international airport is. The day after, a lot of the migrants were still there. The day after, a lot of the migrants were still there. Because the transactional decision with the family had already been made. The money they represent over somewhere else was more important than their physical presence. So now they're back with the debt. And so people who went there, maybe they even went there through regular means, the first thing they're thinking is, how am I going to get back? But this time I'm going to go through a smuggling route. This time I'm going to go through just any kind of path, because now there's the debt that's being compounded and addressed. And that's how you really see vulnerability increase, when people have a debt that then can't be repaid, but then maybe they're returned, the debt doesn't go away, and how do you throw a conflict in there, and you can end up with some fairly horrific situations. A couple, you can keep it on this. Just a couple more things that you can't see because it's too small. Are just statistics about Turkey holding a couple million Syrian refugees. The millions that Pakistan have been holding of Afghan refugees for decades, and you have Afghan kids, grandkids, et cetera, that now live in Pakistan or live in Iran. And the massive amounts of refugees that are hosted in developing countries. Because so often the focus is about refugees that are coming into the US, refugees that are coming into Europe. You turn, particularly 18 months ago, you turn on the TV and it's this massive group of people that are coming to try to reach Europe, particularly from Syria. But facts are important. And the problem with facts is that they're so often in small font. But they are important, and they can help guide just some more rational discourse about the issues of migration. The last comment, again in the font size that's too small, is that something flipped about migration and movement about 2-3 years ago. The movement, because we call it the global north, the global south, the developing world versus the developed world, and that's north-south is kind of the terminology which is used in my field. And south-north migration was eclipsed by south-south migration. So more people moved from the developing world to the developing world then they move from the developing world to the developed world. It's showing shifting economies, it's showing a whole variety of different things. But one concerning thing for myself and humanitarian organizations is that, you know, as you move down the countries of financial means, when you get to countries with less financial means, then you get to countries that have less ability to enforce human rights, enforce equal labor laws, enforce all of these different things. So when you get Burmese moving into Thailand or Burmese moving into Malaysia, it's different than when you get people from El Salvador coming to Canada to work on in a meat processing plant, just as an example. So that's it on these small statistics. Just next slide, please. And this slightly bigger font, but still you probably can't read it, and that's okay. This I just pulled off the State Department website. So when we look at our figures and our different projections for refugee resettlement, then we're looking at about 45,000 as the proposed 2018 ceiling. In the end, it'll be less, but that's the figure that we're looking at. And you know, I've got to keep my UN hat on, to be honest. Every country has the right to define sovereignty as it chooses, and every country has the right to define the ultimate act of sovereignty is who comes across their border. But when we think of the displacement figures and we think of the numbers that Pakistan absorbs and the numbers that Turkey absorbs and the numbers that Kenya absorbs of Somalis, when you think of those numbers, and then you look at this number, it is striking, the discrepancy. Now, the U.S. helps in many different ways because it's also a donor. Yeah, so support to the different countries and activities where refugees are working in or based in other countries. Still, your assistance, your tax dollars are still helping to facilitate that. But as far as resettlement numbers, again, you're looking at that 45,000, and you know it's State Department figures. You can see where we were in 2016 at 84,000. 2017 was proposed at 110. Where we are 2018, 45,000. I'm not editorializing, I'm just pulling out a State Department website. So the next couple of slides are, I'm just gonna talk a bit about flows and where people are going, how they're moving. And I figured I'd start as far away from the US as possible. So that's Australia. And Australia has some pretty rigorous immigration procedures in order to kind of restrict the numbers. And just a question, does anyone remember, it was in the paper more 4 years ago, the concerns about boat arrivals into Australia? I see some nodding heads. So that had a huge reaction, not just amongst Australian politicians, but amongst the population at large, that this had to stop. And so although the really significant majorities are coming, the larger country in red, that's China, that's through regular migration, that's not irregular migration, that's through purchasing of houses, that's economic trade. Same thing, you have it a lot coming from Western Europe. The big concern are actually where you don't see that many lines. It's not that significant numbers, but it's the movements of people from South Asia, the movements of people from Southeast Asia that are looking to get to Australia. They transit through Indonesia. Australia finances the Indonesian Coast Guard to a certain extent to help stop that movement that is that's trying to transit from Southeast Asia, South Asia, into Australia via boats. So that's Australia. So then we have South Asia, and that's where we stop kind of pushing towards the east. Southeast Asia is more towards Australia. When you get to South Asia, you get a lot of people who are moving to the Gulf states. Huge agreements that are created between countries that need enormous amount of labor. For Qatar to have the World Cup, it needs to have the stadiums. For Dubai to have the tourists, it needs to have the hotels, it needs to have all of the different infrastructure. So you have large movements from South Asia that are moving into the Middle East, and they normally move based upon bilateral labor agreements. And I don't want to lose a crowd going too much into that, but you know how the U.S. took a step back from the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, the TPP, because it wanted to deal with countries bilaterally. Well, that's the same approach that Saudi Arabia would take with Nepal. Right? You could have Nepal and Sri Lanka and Pakistan and a bunch of other countries come together, collective bargaining, these are the standards for our migrants. But Saudi would rather sit across the table from Sri Lanka. Just say, hello, I am Saudi, you are Sri Lanka. Let's establish some terms on how we're going to exchange money for labor. And so there's a lot of bilateral agreements that have a lot of South Asian flows going into, again, particularly the Middle East. If the next slide is correct, this is one of, is that the, let me just see. Could you go, you see where it says Rohingya? 1, 2, yeah, perfect. So this is Southeast Asia. And just again, want to see any nodding heads about hearing about the Rohingya. This is horrible. I used to be an Asia guy. That's what I worked in Asia a while. So all that in the red, Rakhine State, that's Western Myanmar, Western Burma. I've spent quite a bit of time there. Cox's Bazar is Eastern Bangladesh. I've spent quite a bit of time there. Now, the Rohingya were based in Western Myanmar, Western Burma, so where the red is. And there's been a lot of infighting with different Buddhist nationalist groups and a big outflow of the Rohingya. Just to put things in context, imagine if when everything went perfectly, when you bribed the right people, when you rolled the dice and got 777s, when everything, all scenarios, the boat was there, you too had an opportunity to be uprooted, lose everything, and become an undocumented refugee in Eastern Bangladesh. If everything works out and you paid the right people. That's just a horrific situation that we're dealing with. It's really significant. It doesn't get as much press in the U.S. It's more an issue in Asia. And please, yeah.
Are you all involved in the political end of trying to find solutions, or more in the support for people's ability to continue to stay alive and eat?
The UN's involved in the political aspects, but my agency is not. As the migration agency, we're more focused on the humanitarian side for this issue. We're more focused on what we'd call the consequences, rather than the root causes. But the root causes are the issue. Who's engaged on it? The US is quite engaged politically. China is quite engaged politically. China's been a supporter of Burma for decades, and so figuring out how that works. There's a regional economic bloc for Southeast Asia called ASEAN. ASEAN is involved politically, but my organization is not. What we're doing, and there's another great UN agency, the refugee agency, UNHCR, the UNICEF, and a lot of NGOs, Save the Children, Oxfam, IRC, and others. What we're working on is making sure there's enough camps in Cox's Bazar as people are coming and services that are available, and also planning for what kind of returns could occur to back to Burma, back to Myanmar when the conditions exist. But that's the frame. When everything's perfect, you might be able to get to eastern Bangladesh. It's just horrible.
Brian,
yes.
quick question for you. You've been doing this a long time. You've probably seen a lot. What keeps you going?
What keeps me going is really good for this business, and it's bad for being a dad, to be honest, Joe. What keeps me going is being very analytical. There's 200,000 Rohingyas that have gone across from western Burma into eastern Bangladesh. Average family size is 6. We're talking about 36,000 households. The poverty indicator, according to the World Bank, was 80%, so that means 20% of the 36,000 households will be able to take care of themselves. So I'm looking at a caseload of 24,000 households. A tent is going to cost $600. 24,000 times 600 is going to be this. We need to have water, sanitation, a latrine, one latrine for every 50 people. We need to have this. So not recognizing that it's Joe and Betsy. Or not recognizing that it's an actual thing. Because when you do, it just crushes me. But I said that the consequence on being a dad is that I can say sometimes I'm dealing with it, and it's a little bit too detached, a little bit too analytical. But these things can be broken down, and they can be costed, and they can be financed. Again, consequences, it's a great question, because again, I'm talking about consequences. I'm not talking about root causes, because that is political. And so that's my safe space. Turning suffering into a spreadsheet, financing it, turning the financing into services, and getting the services delivered. That's how. Yes, and then.
I'm curious about how, so you're describing it from the point of view of the funding agencies. What effect does the presence of whatever 600,000 Rohingya in Bangladesh, what does that have on Bangladesh? Are they also providing, and at the same time, I'm assuming that a certain percentage of Bangladeshis are in Qatar or someplace in the Emirates, probably the more skilled class. But how does this end up affecting Bangladesh also?
It's a. Let me try to answer it a couple different ways. First off, you hit the nail on the head when you talked about people going into Bangladesh, but people also leaving Bangladesh. Because the linear concept of I am rich country, this is poor country, this poor country wants to come to me, get a job, now it's changed, and that's indicated with this South-South migration dynamic. You have all these different flows where countries are receiving countries, they're transit countries, and they're sending countries, and they're that at the same time. So it's multiple different policies. You could have, and I don't want to use Bangladesh in this example because I don't want it to come across as political, but you could get an official of a country to be very concerned about large numbers of undocumented people coming into their country and therefore not wanting to apply various norms. At the same time, how about those norms being applied to their own citizens when they're in that country? Because in a multilateral process, that hypocrisy bubbles up real quick. And so that's the challenge. But answering specifically your question, people don't like camps. Camps are horrible places. And my agency is the global lead mandated by the Secretary General for camp management. We share that role with UNHCR, the refugee agency. So I've been doing camps for a long time. They're horrible, horrible places. They create dependence, sexual violence against women. They're normally detached from where you can access livelihoods. Camps are easy to open and hard to close. So a lot of people don't go into camps. So I'm trying to answer. So you could get up to 90% of a caseload that's actually not in some isolated place, but they're mixed within the broader community. What does that do? It drives down wages, because these are people that will accept an ability to feed their family for less than others. That creates a friction. It creates its own xenophobia that if you don't work on, it can continue to grow. We could go across the country and talk about Venezuela, Colombia right now. There was a time when Venezuela welcomed many, many Colombians because of the troubles that Colombia is still dealing with today. But you go back 15 years, and we're talking about large numbers that were moving into Venezuela, where Venezuela accepted them with open arms to a large extent. There's always issues, and now it's in the reverse, and Colombia feels an obligation to be supportive. But that issue of driving down wages and the friction that gets caused at social cohesion level, that's still apparent. It's apparent in Bangladesh, and it's apparent in all of these different dynamics. We know how strong an economic argument can be. Yes.
What are the supermarkets like in Bangladesh compared to what we have here, like giant staples? Are there PXs and commissaries for Americans who are abroad?
If you're within the State Department or you're with the Department of Defense, then you do live a little more of a walled-off life. But for the UN, for NGOs, it's still like I've been in Somalia, and you're not eating on the local economy in Mogadishu because it's just so risky. But in Bangladesh, it's okay. There are attacks, there are issues, but there's local markets. It's not like chains. It's more the mom and pop shops. 1950s America, I guess, would be sort of where the supply chain equivalent would be. Oh, it's just. Yeah, it's a lot of rice. It's a lot of naan. So just the flatbread, beans. Meat is a bit expensive certainly for this. I'll tell you a story. When I was in eastern Bangladesh in a camp, and I'm not trying to bring it out just for emotive value, but you brought up food. There was a cesspool in the middle of one of the refugee camps, and all the open sewers flew into it. So obviously there's a lot of catfish. So the displaced populations were able to contribute to the food supply chain of the catfish, but they weren't allowed to fish them out. That they had to pay for. So protein's a little bit harder because there's a cost angle, but you can get that largely through beans as well. Yeah, a question.
I have a question about lexicon. You and your slides on different websites use different terms that seem like maybe they matter, but maybe they don't. They're just different ways of talking about things. Displaced persons and refugees and migrants and immigrants and are they? Does that categorization matter in terms of services and what kinds of things are available and whether the U.S. is involved or not, or are they just different ways of not using the same word over and over again?
They do matter, and like any industry, there's conversations about boundaries and mandates and where one ends and another begins. I'll try to define 3 terms. A migrant's a person on the move. A migrant is someone who is not where they are from.
Without indication as to whether they're documented or not documented, or
But you are a migrant.
Exactly. I'm a migrant. I was a migrant for 18 years. And technically now I'm still a migrant because I'm from Connecticut. A refugee is a legal term defined in the 1951 Convention on Refugees. And that is an individual who has crossed an international border who has a fear of persecution. And that fear of persecution is a hugely important issue. That's why it hasn't come up that much lately, but a few years ago, the phrase climate refugee was starting to drip into the popular lexicon a bit more. But until you can prove that through the weather God is persecuting you, you wouldn't be able to get that refugee status.
and is that then related to asylum seeking?
Exactly.
Okay.
So you'd have someone crosses an international border. And let me get that. So the third term is an IDP, an internally displaced person. Someone on the move because of a natural disaster or a conflict who has not crossed an international boundary. But if you're a refugee, you've crossed that boundary, and you're stating, I have a fear of persecution. Then there's a status determination. Is your fear of persecution valid, or is it not valid? And if it's valid, then you would be granted refugee status, which in and of itself affords you the international protection, but it doesn't guarantee you anything. If you get refugee status, if I have refugee status, I don't get a menu to say, maybe not Australia. I kind of want it. It's Idaho. It doesn't work that way. Countries, if you go to that earlier slide, you don't need to. It's okay. But remember, there was the 45,000 for the U.S. It is a matter of no, yes, nope, yes, no. But that's after years of interviews and processing, and you make a determination about who you want to come into your country. I think I'm going to have this statistic's not going to be perfectly correct, but I think that the average duration of someone in refugee status prior to any kind of resettlement is 18 years. That's slightly skewed because of the Palestinians, because the Palestinians have been in that refugee status for multi-generations. But if you remove them, and again, I know this number is not perfect, but it's quite close. If you remove them, then I think you get down to about 10. You're still talking about 10 years of after you've crossed the international boundary. done the status determination, been granted international protection, and are a refugee. Yes?
I want to ask you about environmental refugees. You were talking about the boat people going to Australia, you mentioned South Asia, but what about the South Pacific,
Mhm.
where their countries are not going to be there,
Yep.
certainly in another generation, probably also Bangladesh. And
Mhm.
what can the international community do about that? What are receiving countries not doing about it? Where do you stand?
Yeah, it's a huge issue to learn the most about that. The body of knowledge which rests on that are located in two places. One, there's a migration and environmental change link on that IOM website, my organization. And then secondly, there's this initiative called the Nansen Initiative, Nansen. And what they did was, because what they've done is brought together the scholars and brought together the practitioners and brought together the governments to talk about what do we do with these people? What are we going to do? And it gets back to the issue that I had, which is the refugee classification's a legal status. Exactly. So what is to be done? Countries are really dealing with it on a case-by-case basis. I know I think Tuvalu, if I'm correct, Tuvalu bought land in Fiji. And they're working out what kind of transfers of sovereignty would occur. There's discussions between the Solomon Islands in Australia, I think, or Solomon Islands in New Zealand. Sorry, it's not my area of expertise. But these different discussions are going on. On the policy level, which is connected to the financing, what the big debate is, are you looking at adaptation or are you looking at relocation? It doesn't. However, for the family on the Cook Islands, you can have a very rational argument that says, I don't care if protecting my small island of 4,000 people costs $80 billion. I didn't create it. Pay, America. Pay, China. Pay, India. I didn't do it. It's just a matter of number of zeros on the end. Yeah, so that's so the smaller Pacific Island states are concerned that if they start talking about other issues aside from how to maintain the status quo, then they're giving up, and then the guy has to go for re-election, right? Or lady, and saying that there's a recognition that sovereignty is time bound. So that anyhow, I don't have any answers at all on that, but that's what the debate is. Is it relocation, or is it about just an issue of reparations or an issue of adaptation? Yeah.
Hopefully quickly, because we're running out of time. I wanted to ask about children who are on them, specifically children accompanied either by a single adult or by unaccompanied from Central America into the U.S., which I feel like is an issue that is not much covered. And I was just wondering what legal protections are potentially available to minors in that situation. Can they apply for asylum? Can they apply for refugee status on their own? Like, if, for example, if they are fleeing gang violence.
Anyone can apply if they have anyone can apply, period. Right? And then, but the status determination is not something that an individual makes. That's just tied into normally done by a lawyer. And if it's the U.S. context, it would be tied in with Homeland Security. About what that status determination would be. I mean, the thing about the unaccompanied minors was, if we go back about 2 years ago, you had maybe, I think that's when it was really in the press the most. All these Central American kids are coming across the border into the U.S. And sovereignty is an important issue, and I'm not trying to be flippant about it, but I was asked to give a presentation at U.S. Southern Command at the Department of Defense in Miami about 18 months ago, because the contingency planning and everything is a very important issue. And I said, imagine if you take all of them, because there was 74,000 in the peak year of unaccompanied minors that had come through. 1 out of every 4 seats in the Rose Bowl would still be empty. Just to put it in context. Violations are violations, sovereignty is sovereignty, nations are going to deal with these issues as they can. But when we think of the great nation that we live in, we think of relative absorptive capacity, we do have to keep things in perspective. And I know we are running out of time. Could you just hit migration flows Europe? I wonder if this is going to be the right one. Yeah, again, this was intentionally confusing. But I just wanted to show what's happened in the current world that we're in, because this is a really big issue that's coming up these days about flows into Europe and all the Syrian refugees and everything. One, if you look right up there, that's Tripoli. Anyone who's been on CNN, watched that lately, you've heard about the slave trade. Where was I? I was in Agadez, which is a main flow place, about 2 months ago. And one of the saddest stories I've ever heard in my life was I was talking with a guy, 19-year-old from Burkina Faso, who was transiting through, and the best day that he ever had was when his Arab slaver sold him to an African slaver. Because as a fellow sub-Saharan African, he felt that he was going to get treated better. It's horrible. Libya, what's going on there? But Gaddafi's gone, so that cork is, and the people are the champagne coming through. Another huge flow area you'll see coming up, Cairo. Mubarak's gone. Another cork. If you go over here, see the flows from Baghdad. Saddam Hussein's gone. Another cork. So those are all pretty horrific people that did horrible things to their citizens for a long time, but they maintained a regime that had sovereignty and had borders and had processes that prevented these different flows. And so now we're dealing with a just different environment where fewer governments actually control the means of state, and they don't control their boundaries. They don't control the movements of people who are going through it. So I didn't mean to end on a pessimistic note, but that is what we're dealing with. But if nations, with the most developed economies in the world, such as Europe or such as the U.S., Australia, UK, etc., can't figure out how to work through these flows, it's challenging to assume that therefore Turkey, Pakistan, and others will be able to. But thanks a lot for your time. I really enjoyed talking about it.
Brian, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Hey, no worries.
That's awesome. Oh, oops, let's get you unmiked.